Chapter 7 of Curious Questions about the Existence and Meaning of Life with Qohelet. Tov Shem Mishem and Tov V'yom Hamavet Miyom Hivaledo Tov Lalechet El Beit Evel Milechet El Beit Mishte Basher Husof Kol Hadam V'Hachayiten El Libo Tov Kas Misechok Ki Bero Apanim Yitav Lev לב חכמים בבית אבל ולב כסילים בבית שמחה. טוב לשמוע גרת חכם מאיש, שומע שיר כסילים. כי ככל הסירים תחת הסיר, כן צחוק הכסיל, וגם זה הבל. כי העוסק יהולל חכם, ויאבד את לב מתנה. טוב אחרית הדבר, מראשיתו טוב ערך רוח, מגבר רוח, אל תבהל ברכך לכעוס, כי כעס בכסילים ינוח. אל תאמר מה היה, שהימים הראשונים היו טובים מאלה, כי לא מחוכמה שאלת על זה. טובה חוכמה עם נחלה ויותר לרעי השמש. כי בצל החוכמה, בצל הכסף, ויתרון הדת, החוכמה תחיה בעליה. ראה את מעשה האלוהים, כי מי יוכל לתקן את אשר עיוותו. ביום טובה היה בטוב, ביום רעה ראה, גם את זה לעומת זה עשה האלוהים, על דברת שלא ימצא האדם. אחריו מהומה, את הכל ראיתי בימי הבלי, יש צדיק עובד בצדקו, ויש רשע מעריך ברעתו. אל תהי צדיק הרבה, אל תתחכם יותר, למה תשומם? אל תרשע הרבה, אל תהי שכר, למה תמות בלא איתך? טוב אשר תאחז בזה, וגם מזה אל תנח את ידיך, כי ירא אלוהים יצא את כולם. החוכמת העוז לחכם 10 שליטים, אשר היו בעיר, כי אדם אין צדיק בארץ, אשר יעשה טוב ולא יחטא. גם לכל הדברים אשר ידברו אל תיתן ליבך, אשר לא תשמע את עבדך מקלליך, כי גם פעמים רבות ידע ליבך, אשר גם אתה, כי היללת אחרים. כל זה ניסיתי בחוכמה, אמרתי אחכמה והיא רחוקה ממני, רחוק מה שהיה ועמוק עמוק מאמצענו. סבותי אני וליבי לדעת לתור לבקש, חוכמה וחשבון לדעת, רשע כסיל והשכלות הוללות. ומוצא אני מר ממוות את האישה אשר היא מצודים וחרמים ליבה אסורים ידיה. טוב לפני האלוהים ימלט ממנה וחוטא ילכד בה. ראה זה מצאתי אמרה קהלת, אחת לאחת למצוא חשבון, אשר עוד ביקשה נפשי ולא מצאתי, אדם אחד מ1000 מצאתי, ואישה בכל אלה לא מצאתי, לבד ראה זה מצאתי, אשר עשה האלוהים את האדם ישר, והמה ביקשו חשבונות רבים. So I'd like to take a look now at the translation that we'll have now on our screen share to share together. And I'll ask, Bev, would you like to read that for us?
Okay.
The one that's on the screen?
Okay. Better a good name than good oil, and the day of death and the day one is born. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all humankind. Let the living take it to heart. Better worry than merriment, for by a scowl the heart is gladdened. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Better to take the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns beneath the pot, so is the laughter of the fool, and this too is mere breath. For oppression's profit drives the wise wild, and bribe betrays the mind. Better a thing's end than its beginning, better patience than haughtiness. Be not rash in your mood to be angry, for anger rests in the lap of fools. Say not, what has happened, that the days gone by were better than these, for you ask not about this in wisdom. Better wisdom with a legacy, it is an advantage to those who see the sun. For in wisdom's shade is money's shade, and the gain of wisdom's knowledge keeps its possessors alive. Consider God's work, for who can straighten what God has made crooked? On the day of good luck, enjoy the good. On the day of evil, see, one against the other God has set, so that one find nothing afterwards. Everything have I seen in my days of mere breath, the righteous perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked living a long life in their evil doing. Be not over righteous, nor over wise. Why should you be dumbfounded? Be not over wicked, nor foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? Why should you die before your time? It is good that you seize this, and from the other as well, do take back your hand, for one who fears God shall be out of them all. Wisdom is stronger for the wise more than 10 rulers who are in the town. For there is not a righteous person on earth who does good and will not offend. To all the words that they speak, do not pay heed, that you hear not your servant reviling you. For oft times too, your heart has known that you too have reviled others. All this I tried through wisdom. I said, let me grow wise, and it was far away from me. Far away, that which was, and deep, deep, who can find it? I turned round in my heart to know and to inquire and seek wisdom and reckoning and to know foolish wickedness and mad folly. So I, woman, more bitter than death, for she is all snares and nets her heart and fetters her arms. One who is good before God will escape her, but an offender will be trapped by her. See, this I have found, said Kohelet, one by one to find out the reckoning. Further I sought and did not find. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all those I did not find. Except, see this I found, that God made humans upright, but they sought more reckonings, many reckonings.
Wonderful. Okay, so I wanted to also just welcome the rest of those who are joining us, Arthur and Naomi. Wonderful to see everybody. We're looking at chapter 7 in Kohelet. We just finished with the chanting of it in the Hebrew. Now we're looking at one of the many translations that we are considering. I have one that I've shared here. I've also put in the chat for everybody to look at the 1916 version of this translation by JPS, and I urge you, if you don't have access to a Hebrew Bible with Kohelet in it, that you can now look in the chat and take a look at that at your screen, so you can scroll at your leisure. And what I'd like to do now is actually to go through and see if you have any questions or observations about this text of Kohelet that we've read so far. Probably one of the strangest and likely one of the more disturbing chapters that we've read so far. Last week when we did chapter 6, I think we could agree that it was one of the darkest and the most pessimistic chapters. And this week, I leave it up to you to decide how you would typify it. Some of you are seeing this material for the first time, so it might be shocking. Kohelet, just to recount, is the name of a philosopher. And the word Kohelet, which is extremely important to go back to from chapter 1, as you can hear in the Hebrew, is a feminine noun. And it's unclear to us who or what Kohelet was or is, whether Kohelet describes the function and the role of the assembler, that is to say, from the same word as Kehillah, Kohelet is the one who gathers people together and serves to assemble people through words of philosophy and provocation. Or was Kohelet actually a woman? And we'll see that there's evidence to this theory actually in this chapter, and yet this is one of the most misogynistic chapters in all of Kohelet. So it's full of paradoxes and provocations, but I'm going to open it up to you first to see if you have any questions or observations, and then I'll share with you a couple reflections that I have seen. So anyone want to share or to begin by asking some questions or sharing with some observations? Yes, Bev. And
Yeah,
then Marion.
I'm finding it difficult to incorporate this into some synthesis. It's almost like these syllogisms. If you don't do this, you do this, or if it's better to be in the house of mourning, and then you're going through these verses, and I can't seem to synthesize the whole message together. That's my problem in this chapter.
Okay, so there are a lot of better X than Y, better X than Y, and I think what you're noticing in that as well is the sense that there is something strange going on in the land of Kohelet. Now, one of the things to can everybody see the screen share of all of us? Do you see us?
I see camels.
Oh, camels. Okay, sorry. One of the things, yes, camels sometimes are a result of reading too much Kohelet early in the morning. One of the things, Bev, that you're noticing that I think is really quite powerful is that there are a lot of cliches and proverbs of wisdom that Kohelet is using. And as I mentioned earlier, cliches are important because they speak to a certain kind of truth after repetition. And even though it seems familiar, Kohelet is actually playing with a lot of cliches within the wisdom world and expecting that you know them. So if we go back, for example, to just the first one that begins, right? Tov Shem Mishem and Tov. So all these betters that are set up, right? Better a good name than a good oil. And then, as you said, so that what does it have to do with the day of death? And the day of death is better than the day one is born, right? So that's a very strange juxtaposition because it seems to actually be a paradox. And part of what Kohelet is trying to do is to begin to make us question the way that our minds work when we begin to make comparisons, when we begin to make assumptions, and when we begin to juxtapose certain cliches to show the paradox. And I think Kohelet is very aware that Kohelet has the capacity to be able to begin to challenge us in terms of conventional wisdom, which has already been critiqued, as well as cliches. And what happens, I guess, with this chapter, especially with all the seeming paradoxes and comparisons, is to say, what's left after better X than Y, better X than Y? What is actually, what remains after the comparison is made? And is there something perhaps in between the X and the Y that remains? Or is it pointing towards something that once the mind becomes wrapped up in this paradox that we didn't normally see in a cliche? Daphne and then Marion. Yeah, Marion.
I'm not sure if this is an appropriate connection, but this chapter made me think of Aristotle, that, you know, he had a sense of that you could only judge somebody if their life was virtuous at the end of their life, because at that point you could only see something that was complete, and therefore you could give a term to it. And I wondered if Kohelet's sense of time here, that the house of mourning is better than the house of merriment, is because the house of mourning is something final and complete in which you can look back and have some kind of rational judgment of what has happened.
I think that's very true. It's a very good observation, and that kind of wisdom that would have been known in the early Greek philosophers, and probably was earlier than Aristotle, however, was based on a sense of virtue. And here, Kohelet doesn't talk as much about virtue, but more about reputation. So we could debate the semantics of that, but the fact that you're pointing to the longue durée of life is really only understood once it passes, I think, is important. And Kohelet is using that as a provocation, not to suggest that, as Kohelet did in chapter 6, that it's better not to be born than to be born, better to be stillborn than to be born, but ultimately that this is supposed to be sobering for us, right? It's better to, and more worthwhile, to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, because the enduring value, or as you said, the virtue here, the tov shem, the reputation that someone has, is going to be known more at a house of mourning for its timelessness than praising a host at a great party, right? So Kohelet is looking for what's timeless. So I think you're right, and I think that we have to really to drill down when we talk about virtue from an Aristotelian perspective, from a Hebrew and Jewish perspective. What is Kohelet more concerned about? Less about virtue per se, but more about meaning in the short duration of life, and what kind of reputation one is able to build based on deeds. And also, last time we saw also on words, right? We have to be careful with your words, because it's better not to make a vow than to leave a vow unfulfilled. Remember, that was a big issue last time, that there was a concern about that. But there is a lot of parallel concerns that you're going to find that come up time and again. In chapter 4, we saw the issue of friendship, and Aristotle outlines the 4 different degrees of friendship as well. Kohelet sees it a little bit differently. So there's similar concerns, but they're sometimes rendered in different ways. But it's a good observation. Daphne?
From what I understand in English, it's like there are 2 roads, and we learn more from difficult roads than for easy roads. Like
that seems to be the pattern here.
Yeah.
Even in chapter 3. I mean, even in verse 3, right? Tov kas mischok, that even worry or anxiety is better than merriment, because by a scowl the heart is gladdened. So, yeah, in terms of the trials and the tribulations and the challenges of life, Kohelet is saying that there's more lasting meaning that can be discovered in that struggle than with pleasure. But remember, in earlier chapters, we didn't do this together, but there was a sense that it is also possible to enjoy the things in life, whether it's the food you put on the table, the wine you can drink. Those are God's gifts, and you're meant to enjoy them, but enjoy them now because they're fleeting, right? But I think here you're right. There was a sense that there's something about the abrasion, and that the quality of abrasion, like the way that that sand, that the abrasion of sand on the oyster is what gives birth to the pearl. It's the same idea here, that there is something worthwhile about challenge, about travail, and about suffering, which we've seen has been an ongoing concern of Kohelet. It's becoming very, very pronounced now. What else do you notice, or other questions you may have, or comments about what we've looked at so far? There's a lot going on here, a lot of cliches and a lot of territories trying to be covered, and then of course that very strange section near the end. We have the comparison once again of the fool and of the sage, and of course what Kohelet is saying ultimately is that I'm trying to find a way to be able to make meaning of my life, and as I go through all of these investigations, what I'm trying to do really is ultimately to find some lasting meaning in terms of what is timeless rather than what is fleeting. Also, what was mentioned, the question that came up earlier, which we look at really every time we're looking at a chapter in Kohelet, is where is God? Does God figure in at all in terms of the investigation that Kohelet is making? And here we have a few references to God. Did you notice the name that's used to evoke God? For example, in, let's see where, it comes up a couple times in this chapter. 18. Like in verse 18, exactly, right? The one who fears Elohim shall get out of them all, right? Or shall be freed of them all. So remember what we said last time regarding this name? It's an ancient name of God. There are many, many different ways of addressing the deity in Judaism and in early Hebrew culture. Elohim is an ancient name, but it's also a very universalistic name. It's not the particular covenantal name of God, which is the 4-letter tetragram, which is the covenantal name. And that's not used at all in this book. So that tells us that whatever the theology is that Qohelet is working with, that the assumption is the only way to be able to relate to God, the ancient power that makes the universe run, is in a universal sense. And remember, everything that Qohelet is talking about always is really investigating what happens from an empirical perspective, tachat hashemesh. That's the expression Qohelet uses, which means this is what I've seen under the sun, which means anything above the sun or beyond the natural world in the supernatural realm, we don't really know about. And he just, Qohelet just continues to sort of push it off and say, those are things we can't really know. All I know is I see oppression, I see suffering, I see challenges, I see the wise, I see the fool, I see the righteous, and I see the wicked. These are all things underneath the sun, which means that these are things that happen in the natural world, and that's what I'm going to comment on based on my experience, but I'm not going to speculate about things that are beyond my comprehension. That's something as well that we've noticed is a trope that we see in other wisdom literature, especially in the book of Job, right? There's a sense of God being far away and far removed from the human's ability to be able to really understand. And so Qohelet says, let me try to make sense of what's going on in this world, because that's all that my mind is able to contemplate. What about this? Some of these verses that move beyond the better than. We'll get to the section about woman in a moment. We'll conclude with that. But what about in verse 20? Ki adam ein tzadik ba'aretz asher ya'aseh tov v'lo yechateh. For there is not a righteous person on earth who does good and will not offend. And then going on from there, Qohelet also speaks about this need not to be over righteous or to be over wicked. Remember that back in verse 16? It's very curious, right? What if you were to talk about it in an Aristotelian perspective, Marion, what Qohelet's saying in verse 16, not to be over righteous or over wise, what is Qohelet pointing to then in terms of the aspirational way of living in the world?
I think it also, his last phrase in the JPS translation, the last sentence of the chapter, which says, "Man is engaged in too much reasoning." That there is a type of reasoning that isn't productive, that is over eager,
right?
And to recognize that we all fall into the categories of the wicked and the fool, and at some point in time we're all there, is sort of a leveling out of the human condition. And
it is. That's true. But so what would Aristotle call that? Maimonides also picked up on that as an Aristotelian later on in the medieval period. But there's something that Qohelet is striving for here, to say, don't be over righteous, don't be over wise. So it's the human condition. So try to follow what?
The golden mean.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So this is a very interesting iteration of that we're seeing very early on, to follow the golden mean. Try to follow a path of moderation in life. Don't be too wise, don't be too foolish, don't be too righteous, don't be too wicked. Just try to find an acceptable golden mean. And this is actually a very pragmatic insight, as well as being a critique of wisdom. There's constantly, as you said at the end, Marion, that final verse is a continual critique of wisdom, right? And the pursuit of wisdom and reasoning. Daphne, you had your hand. You want to say something?
Yeah, I have a question. Number 13. Is God responsible that what is going wrong in the world?
It's a great question. So verse 13 is a very strange verse. Re'et ma'aseh Elohim, again, look at God's work as Elohim, the general deity who created the world and then removed God's self from the world. Like remember Plato's parable of the Watchmaker? Do you remember that from Philosophy 101? Daphne, what's the parable of the Watchmaker? Or who remembers? Marion, do you remember? Arthur, do you remember?
I don't think it's Plato. It's Plato.
I thought it was Plato. Maybe it's Aristotle. It's a Greek. It's definitely a Greek myth that's used by the Greek philosophers. But what's the parable of the watchmaker?
Well, God created the world and left.
Right, but how does it work? That's the nimshal. That's the meaning of it. But what's the parable of the watchmaker? It's likened to a watchmaker who conceives of the most wonderful Swiss watch you could ever imagine. It's immaculately designed, beautiful hour hands and second hands, and all the machinations are absolutely stunning. It's a breathtaking design. And finally, from the thought of this remarkable watch, it is executed and it is created. And once it's created, then the watchmaker is no longer responsible for it. There's no guarantee on the watch. And once you put it onto your wrist, it starts to corrode and it breaks. So this is likened, this parable is meant to teach that God is like the watchmaker who conceives of a perfect world and then ultimately creates the world and then leaves that world to humankind. And as soon as human beings get hold of the world, they corrupt it and destroy it. And the watchmaker is sitting in the watch factory watching and either laughing or crying. So that's the vision of a distant, transcendent God who's very far removed from the doings of humankind. And when you look at this verse, you have to ask yourself the question, Daphne, which is a great question. Who's responsible for being metaken? Kohelet asked the question, right? Look at what God created, and then it's unclear what you're seeing. But if you look through the lens of Kohelet, you'll see that it is, as Hobbes said, nasty, brutish, and short, and wicked. That's the way that the world looks. Ki mi yuchal letaken? Who's going to be able to fix this, right? The watchmaker created the watch, but now is no longer, there's no guarantee that you can call on to fix it because the watchmaker is not coming back to fix the watch. God is not coming back into the garden to fix what humanity has done after being exiled, right? Who can straighten or who can fix what God has made crooked? So it's a very disturbing disturbing line. What are some of the other translations you have with you on verse 13? Any other ways of looking at it aside from straightening that which God has made crooked? I mean, the assumption is that if something was made crooked, it's not exactly the parable of the watchmaker that I was suggesting earlier. It means that God has made a broken watch. So it's even more pessimistic than the parable of the watchmaker that the Greek philosophers use.
In the art scroll, it says, "For who can straighten what he has twisted?"
Mm. And that's referring back to what? To the person or to God?
To God.
Uh-huh.
It's a he, it's a God. Observe God's doing. For who?
Right. Okay. So in any event, whatever language you use to translate it, it's quite a provocative and disturbing statement, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Marion?
Is there a parallel? You know, I forget where I heard it rather than read it. Between what is twisted and mere breath, that there's a sense of that what we perceive on the surface as what is twisted is also part of our consistent pursuit of trying to follow things that are not valuable. So that when we see that there's some parallel between the two.
I don't think Qohelet has explicitly said that yet, but you're definitely using the language of Qohelet to say, from a pragmatic perspective, if you can't know into the divine mind to understand the way that the creation works, then why would you waste your time trying to figure out why it's broken? Right? That's also, if that's the case, then it's also, again, another disturbing way of looking at what is the Hebrew philosopher and the Jewish person supposed to do when you see something broken in the world. We normally say we're supposed to follow the vision of the prophets and to cry out to fix it, right? And for change, for tikkun and for tshuva. Kohelet is taking a step back and saying it's really, there's a certain cyclical nature to the way the world works under the sun in the natural world. And we saw that in chapter 1, all the cycles that continue turning and returning again. And you just have to learn how to navigate it. But don't fool yourself into thinking that you can change it or that you can fix it. So there is an element of pessimism. There is an element of stoicism, and perhaps of quietism to what Kohelet is alluding to here. And much of it is rhetorical. These are questions that Qohelet just keeps throwing out at us and throwing out and throwing out. And there's not necessarily final conclusions, but they're meant to be provocative questions.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to share that people have questions about? Should we go to the most disturbing part of the whole chapter, the most provocative and surprising? So this I've always struggled with and tried to figure out what is Qohelet really doing, and then also at the same time you have to ask yourself the question, who is Qohelet here? So if we assume that Qohelet is one author through all 12 chapters, and again by the time we get to the 12th chapter that may be disrupted once again, but remember that when we opened the book of Qohelet, you remember how chapter 1 verse 1 began with the superscription? It said Divrei Qohelet ben David Melech B'Yerushalayim. So the superscription is saying these are the words of Qohelet, who is the son of David, king in Jerusalem, which would then make Qohelet whom? Solomon. Okay, and so we've seen that the mask of Solomon and the persona of Solomon as the wisest and the most wealthy of all rulers who ruled over Jerusalem is supposed to be the prototype of the person who's able to examine all of life under the sun, because Solomon has everything at his disposal, right? And he can make these experiments through the material world. But when we get to this section here, it's hard to really figure out, especially because I want to draw your attention to two things. First of all, the way that Qohelet speaks about women here is quite provocative, and some would say it's misogynistic. But it is speaking about woman here in a way that is strange. It's hard to really to discern whether we're talking about the symbol of the woman or we're talking about an actual woman. The way that I read it and make sense of it is I'll share with you, and we can talk about this. If you look at verses 26 onwards, right? If you look at the way that it's written in the Hebrew, there's a few things I want to draw to your attention, and then I'll share my comment. So I found woman more bitter than death. But it says, really, I found the woman. That is to say, ha-isha, right? It's not that I found a woman, but I have found woman as an essential category, okay? So that the woman is more bitter than death, for she is all snares, and that's her heart, and fetters her arms. One who is good before God will escape her, but an offender will be trapped by her. And then in 27, it says the strangest thing. See, I have found this. Re'eh ze matzati amra Qohelet. Now, until this point, whenever we say Qohelet said something, the other two references to Qohelet using that verb, both in chapter 1, verse 2 and chapter 12, verse 8, which becomes the framework with what Qohelet said, is declined in the masculine, but here it's declined in the feminine. So Qohelet here is a woman speaking about women, or about the symbol of the woman. So it now becomes even more strange and paradoxical. I don't believe this is a scribal error. I actually believe this is part of the project of Qohelet, which is to disorient us and to provoke us, because of course, if you had a male character who was, even if it was Solomon who made these kind of pronouncements, it would probably be easier to dismiss it and to say, oh, he's just being, a nasty misogynist. But now what happens when you turn this kind of comment around and it becomes an internal critique of the symbol of the woman that is given by a woman? Suddenly it's a very strange and disorienting thing to read. And we have to ask ourselves the question, what is Qohelet trying to accomplish? And what I want to suggest and for us to think about is that there is a juxtaposition here between the different personifications of wisdom. If we look in other of the wisdom texts, especially in Proverbs 1 through 9, as well as in Proverbs 31, there is a strong juxtaposition between the symbol of the woman who is the seductress and who is demonic and has a certain kind of knowledge that leads us astray, and the symbol of the woman who is, everybody probably knows this version of the woman, the Eshet Chayil, right? She is the heroine of Friday night. And her praises are more valuable than rubies. She is praised around the table. And so there is a juxtaposition already in Proverbs that it's clear Kohelet is playing with, between the personification of wisdom as something that is seductive and tempting and leads us towards a kind of evil way of thinking. And there is the personification of wisdom as a woman that can be righteous and that can be redemptive and that can be holy. And that's what I think actually Kohelet is playing with, rather than just simple misogyny. I think that this is actually a personification of wisdom. And of course, what's the name for wisdom that we see sometimes being used here, but all throughout the wisdom literature texts, like in the book of Proverbs and Job, especially in Proverbs, wisdom also is a feminine noun. What is the word for wisdom in Hebrew? Chokhmah. Chokhmah, right? The equivalent in Greek would be Sophia. And if you go back to the early Greek mystery cults, there were those who also worship Sophia, and there was an ambivalence as we go through the closing of the Bible and the rabbinic period to how much of the feminine could be rendered or engendered to such a high ideal that was godlike. And that was a conflict that emerged in the rabbinic period. But in these biblical texts, you can see that there's something going on here in terms of, first of all, the elevation of the value of chokhmah as being extremely important, while also being suspicious of too much chokhmah because it can lead you astray. But it's using, I think, here, especially being reinforced by the declension of the verb in verse 27, that this is a very disorienting and provocative statement that is made by a woman philosopher about the personification of wisdom as a woman, either for better or for worse, either for purposes that are constructive or purposes that are destructive. And wisdom has that capacity to take us in either direction. So thoughts, let's talk about that for a bit. It's maybe not the way that you would read it, but it's something that I've struggled with for a little while, and I actually just found this time around in reading Qohelet in Thomas Kruger's commentary for the Hermenia series that he actually agrees with me. So it doesn't mean that it makes the argument any stronger, but it means that there are others who suggest this reading is also possible. So what do you think of this, Marion?
It made me wonder if wisdom at times itself is actually another name for God. I don't know if that's something blasphemous to say or not, but
not here. No.
Only because when you don't find it, the bitterness was the same as the last chapter, that thin sort of amount of redemption that we're going to get from the whole theme of the last chapter sort of fits in with the bitterness.
In chapter 6, you spoke about that as the thin crust of redemption. That was a great image. And maybe the only way to be able to hold on to or to grasp onto that precipice is through chokhmah. And as I said, if you look in Proverbs, chokhmah has divine qualities, that's for sure. And then as you move into Jewish mysticism in the medieval period, chokhmah is an attribute of the divine. So it's clear that we're playing with something that has that kind of resonance. So far in Qohelet, I don't think it's necessarily as explicit, but it's definitely, it's one of the roads to, it's the lifeline to living some kind of meaningful life. And in that sense, for Qohelet, that's as good as God can get, because you can't really know God. So I think what you're saying is true, is that if you can't know God, then you might as well try to cultivate wisdom. So I think it's a very good observation. Other things that you notice or reactions to that suggestion? And it's interesting too, look at the way that it ends. There's a lot of repetition in Qohelet's thinking. That verse 29, says, look, except this is all the things that I have found, that God made humans upright. So this is now an interesting return to that earlier question that was raised by Morton. I thought God made everything crooked, right? So who can fix it if it was all made crooked? So what exactly was made crooked if God has, it says here, Asher asa Elohim et Adam yashar. God made us upright, right? But what's the problem? Hema bikshu cheshbonot rabim. But we always seek many reckonings. And there's this repetition because we're in the end of tax season. It's important to say it. Cheshbon, if you're in Israel and you want to get your bill, you ask for the cheshbon, right? Bavakasha tenli et cheshbon. So the cheshbon is the accounting. And there are a lot of metaphors of accounting that go on throughout Kohelet, which also leads some of the commentators to speculate that maybe Kohelet was also someone who was high up in the bureaucracy, or at least aware of the trappings of bureaucracy, and may have been someone like a treasurer, because so many metaphors, accounting metaphors, are used. But it's interesting to see God made us upright. So now going back to the parable of the watchmaker, God made a perfect clock. Each one of us has inside of us a perfect clock that makes us tick. But we have sought to make things crooked, or we have sought to get all confused by making all of these calculus and accountings. And as Marian said, by just trying to reason too much with the mind in a way that's destructive and not constructive. So we are doing things with our mind that lead to behavior that is aberrant, when we have within us the ability to be able to actually live an upright life. But why don't we? Right? So there's a sort of another almost rhetorical question here at the end in verse 29 that goes back to and echoes that verse that we saw earlier in 13. Who can fix what God has made crooked? And I guess that's an underlying question that we have to sit with. If God has made us upright, and we're the ones who've broken the clock, then who's responsible for fixing the clock? Is it the watchmaker, or is it the watch owner? Is there any sense of co-partnership here, or is this really just a relationship of exchange? It's an interesting question to think about, right? To what degree are we responsible to the clockmaker? To what degree are we responsible to other clock owners? And you remember, if you go back to chapter 4, Qohelet says that friendship actually is important, but not with women. It's between men, right? So once again, it's a very strange series of juxtapositions, that there is a sense you should not be completely alone in the world. Tova shnayim min ha'echad. It's better to have two than one. And then Qohelet says, Chuta meshulash lo bimhira yenatek, that a three-fold cord is not easily broken. That's in the company of men, most likely. And now there's this critique of the personification of woman as wisdom. And then the question, unto whom am I responsible? Do I have any responsibility for being created in the divine image? Or because God has now become removed from the inner workings of my life and the world, does that mean now that that I'm ultimately responsible to humanity? Qohelet doesn't answer the question, but leaves us with these very provocative, open-ended questions. What do you think about that as a way of looking at your life and looking at the world? Does it resonate with you? Does it disturb you? Disorient you? Does it hit home as an affirmation of something that you've been thinking but afraid to say? And suddenly Qohelet said, he said, I can't believe someone in Jewish life actually thinks the way I do. Maybe that's the reason why Qohelet is only read on Sukkot, because there's so few Jews around during Sukkot. They can't hear the radical message of Qohelet. Because I've always said Qohelet should be recited on Yom Kippur, but I haven't gotten a lot of traction on that one. It's curious though, isn't it? It's very curious. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to share before we conclude. I think those are the main points, and I would really strongly encourage you for next time not to take on faith anything that I said, but to question everything that I've said. That would Kohelet would be much more pleased if we did that by questioning the one who poses the questions. I want you to also please look at Proverbs that I referred to see whether this resonates as a strong argument for you, and specifically look at Proverbs. The link that I shared with you will take you to the JPS translation, the bilingual translation of the book of Proverbs. Read through chapters 1 through 9, and then compare it to chapter 31. Okay, so when you go through it and you see specifically in, yeah, so if you go to 31, it's the last chapter, and you will notice that here in chapter 31, I want you to start on verse 10. Here, I'll, do you have the share up there? Let me see here. Here, on chapter 31 in Proverbs, if you start with chapter 31, verse 10, Eshet Chayil Mi'imtza. So if you're familiar with it, read it again with new eyes. And if you haven't seen it before, read it for the first time and see what you discover about the personification of the Isha. Here she's called the Eshet Chayil, and the personification of Chochmah here, as opposed to the ones that we see in Proverbs chapters 1 all the way through 9. Right? And here, Chochmot banta beita, wisdom, she has built her house. She has hewn it out of 7 pillars. It's a fascinating description and recounting, as Marion was saying, of the divine qualities that Chochmah has to actually to be able to create the world. There is a floor plan that is created by Chochmah in relationship to the greater deity, and there's a conversation that's going on here between Chochmah and one of the facets of the divine. So for next time, that would be something I would recommend, is to look at Proverbs chapters 1 through 9, and then compare it to Proverbs chapter 31, verses 11 all the way through to the bottom of 31. And then we will resume again together next time, God willing, and we will look at chapter 8 together. Sounds like a plan?
Yeah. Yashikor.
Yashikor.
Ashkwa, thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. Wonderful to see you all. And the
too.
archives of our last meetings hopefully are all almost all available on the website, so feel free to catch up on those, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.